Yo, what's going on, y'all? It's Cone back here again today with another episode of After the Buzzer, the show where I recap the NBA games from the night. We had 4 games here on a Sunday, non-stop, all-day playoff hoops from around 1 p.m. Eastern to right around midnight. And luckily enough for y'all, I watch every single second of it because I'm addicted to NBA playoff basketball. I'm sure a lot of you are too. So we've got a lot to talk about. I'm of course going to break down every game. As always, there will be timestamps. But I want to begin with this Bucks versus Pacers game 4, and more specifically the series as a whole. One that was incredibly intriguing coming into things. Of course, these two teams played each other 5 times this season, with the Pacers winning 4 of them, including getting a W in the in-season tournament semifinals. That was back when Tyrese Haliburton was playing out of his mind. He was dropping like 26 and 12. He waned a little bit over the course of the season, but none of the games that these two teams played happened over that period. Meanwhile, for the Bucks, they got amazing play from Giannis in those games, but it wasn't enough except for one of them where he went out there and dropped the franchise record for points in a game. And that led to the whole game ball situation where Giannis, they took it, but they said that they didn't have it, and there was yelling and running to the locker room, a whole situation. So these two teams have a little bit of both on the court and off the court history, not to mention very intriguing play styles, because both of them are these offensively focused, defense optional type of teams. So it felt like we would see this high level shootout between these two squads, and all season they were kind of dancing around the possibility of facing off against each other, but it almost felt destined that we would see these two teams play in a playoff series, and right now we are, but unfortunately it's not exactly going the way that I was hoping for. I think anybody really was. This is of course because Giannis Antetokounmpo has not played in any of these games. He suffered that calf injury towards the end of the regular season. We weren't sure about his status going into it. It felt like he could definitely return, but with a calf injury, you have to be careful because that can lead to an Achilles injury or something more substantial. So you really have to take your time, make sure he's 100% ready to go. And it did still feel like the Bucks could make this very competitive and keep the team afloat until Giannis returned, with Dame being out there and him now having a moment to prove why the Bucks traded for him. Still had Chris Middleton, who was finally healthy and staying on the court for the first time in a while, Brook Lopez, Bobby Portis. This was still a very talented team. However, they're now down 3-1 with no Giannis return potentially in sight. Doc said he feels optimistic he can return the series, but he's running out of time to come back because there may not be a game 6 or a game 7 if things keep going this way, especially because not only is Giannis now hurt, which is a massive blow to them on both sides of the ball, but Damian Lillard also did not play in this game due to Achilles soreness. He suffered an injury, I think it was in the final game of the season against the Magic with that Achilles, and he was a bit limited in some practices leading up to the playoff series. He ended up playing. He was great throughout the first few games, but in game 3, towards the end of it, you could clearly see he wasn't himself. He was limping a little bit out there. He was not really touching the ball, kind of being used as a decoy, which Doc Rivers admitted after the game. And coming into today, Damian Lillard was listed as doubtful, and we saw him at the game in a boot, which is supposed to be used to kind of keep some of the pressure off of that. They still feel like he's, not shut down or anything. He can return, but this is now not one, but both of your superstars that are out, with your team having their backs against the wall in a 3-1 deficit against a team that's had your number this entire season. And not to mention, not only did they have neither of them in this game, but Chris Middleton has been dealing with ankle injuries. He suffered one in this game, so he's playing on a couple of bad ankles, and Bobby Portis got ejected in less than 7 minutes in this contest. He had an altercation with Andrew Nembhard where he ends up throwing like a little bit of a slap at him, gets ejected. So not only do they not have Bobby Portis, but Chris Middleton's not himself, no Dame, no Giannis, and this leads to them losing by double digits. Credit to the Bucks, they held their own for the first half, kept it within single digits, with Chris having 25, Brook Lopez having 27 points, Malik Beasley dropping 20. They just couldn't get any stops whatsoever. This has never been a good defensive team. You take Giannis out of the equation, it's going to be near impossible for them to slow guys down. Not to mention Bobby Portis at least gives them some size, which they could have used against a guy like Miles Turner, who had 29 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists, 3 blocks, 7 threes. Probably the best game of his career, I would say. Tyrese had 24, 4, and 4, was just dicing up this Bucks defense, driving and kicking out to everybody. The Pacers were spraying the Bucks with threes, whether it was Neesmith or Nembhard or Obi Toppin. There was no hope for the Milwaukee Bucks. It already was going to be a tough series for them going up against this team if they were fully healthy, although I think they would have won. Never mind with everything seemingly falling apart for the Milwaukee Bucks at the very final moment of their season. It really sucks because coming into this season, I remember when the Dame trade happened, everybody was like, oh, it's going to be Milwaukee versus Boston, especially when Jrue Holiday was dealt over to the Celtics. It's going to be those two teams facing off in the Eastern Conference Finals for a battle of who's the best in the East. everybody was picking sides. I was over on the side of Boston, but I was like, that has to go 7 games. It would be one of the best series we've seen in a very long time. And just over the course of the year, the Bucks have unfortunately just continuously fallen apart, whether it was their own fault with them just not playing very well, Adrian Griffin not being the fit for them at head coach, and getting fired despite them being the 2 seed because the on-court product did not match where they were in the standings. Then you bring in Doc Rivers and they look good for a little bit, but they end up falling apart and going under 500 under him throughout the regular season, finishing with less than 50 wins, which if I had told you this Bucks team wasn't going to win 50 games before the season with no crazy major injuries to Dame or Giannis, you would have called me crazy. So it was just a disappointing regular season, but at least going into the playoffs, I felt like with the talent you have there with Giannis and Dame, if they can just stay healthy, they could probably still make some noise, especially because that Celtics team where at the beginning of the year they felt destined to face them, they were on the opposite side of the bracket, and you're facing like the Pacers, who are pretty young and inexperienced, and they've had no ability to stop Giannis this entire season. You would then face the winner of the Knicks and the Sixers, who are both really beat up in their own regards. It felt like a real possible path to the Bucks still making a conference finals run, even though I didn't really feel like they could beat Boston. They still had a little bit of hope, in my opinion. However, with these injuries continuously piling up, I just don't see how they get out of this series against the Pacers. Even if Giannis and Dame come back, we don't know how much they're going to look like themselves. You risk bigger injuries to both of them. And again, it's still a Pacers team who has beaten you 4 times out of 5 in the regular season this year and now 3 times out of 4 here in the playoffs. So is it worth even bringing them back at this point? And if you lose here in the first round in dominant fashion like it seems like they're going to, this is such an incredible disappointment of a season for the Bucks, a team that a lot of people picked to win the championship. They gave up everything to go ahead and make the trade for Dame after last year losing the first round. To just do it again, it's a massive failure. But at the same time, while theoretically they could have still lost with everybody healthy, what would it have looked like if they had their guys on the court? Could they have still gone on that run? That leads to even more question marks in the offseason, where rather than having seen how they played in the playoffs and being a first-round exit, you can say, okay, this is what we need to change. Now you just kind of have to go off hypotheticals, how you played in the regular season, which doesn't always apply to the playoffs. It's a whole mess. This whole season, the Bucks have been on this continuous downward spiral, it's felt like, to the point where at the end, they've just fallen apart completely. I imagine they'll probably just running this thing back, even if they do end up bowing out here in the first round, which maybe that works, but there weren't a lot of indications in the regular season that this thing is up to the level of other great teams in the NBA. Like, you look at the competition, the Western Conference, there are a number of teams that I would take over this Bucks team in a series, even when fully healthy. And the East, the Celtics feel far and away the best team in the East at the moment. So is it going to be good enough? Like, how do you even make changes when you've given up a lot of your assets? They're just in a really tough spot that's not helped by all the injuries that really, unfortunately, have just completely derailed them here at the end of the season. And I do want to give credit to the Pacers. They're not only winning this series because the Bucks are injured. They have really stepped up. They've played amazing despite great games from like Chris Middleton and Damian Lillard at different points. They have thrived, whether it was Tyrese or the role players on these teams, Miles Turner playing great. They have held their own. Siakam was fantastic. He had like 30 and 10 the first 2 games roughly. This is a great effort from Indiana. It seems like they're going to move on to the second round, which is a massive accomplishment this season for them and a great selling point to bring Pascal Siakam back. I just can't help but think about what this Bucks team could have done if Giannis was playing, what it means for their future, and where they go from here, where a lot of their failures were their fault, but here at the end of the season, they just got really unlucky with these injuries, which ultimately derailed a year that was supposed to be way more promising than it ended up being, seemingly. Moving on now, let's go ahead and talk about Knicks versus Sixers, which has been the best series, in my opinion, up to this point. It's been incredibly physical, it's been gritty, had crazy endings, and these two teams and fan bases really don't like each other, and this all culminated in a Game 4 where Jalen Brunson, who has kind of struggled a little bit throughout this series, having one of the best games I've ever seen by point guard in the playoffs. 47 points, which is the most points in Knicks history in a playoff game, 4 rebounds, 10 assists, and a steal on 53% shooting. And he generated all that offense in a game where the New York Knicks only put up 97 points. He scored 47 of their 97 points and got 10 assists to go along with that. There's some stat I saw where he's like the only player ever to have a 40 and 10 or 45 and 10 game where his team scored less than 100 points in a playoff setting. It was unbelievable, whether it was mid-range jumpers, him working out of the post as a point guard for some reason, knockdown threes, floaters, push shots. He was getting to his spot with ease. None of the Sixers defenders were working on, whether it was Tyrese Maxey, D'Anthony Melton, Tobias Harris, Kelly Oubre. Joel Embiid himself couldn't even stop him from scoring in the mid-range. Just insane display, one of the most dominant displays I've ever seen. And meanwhile, for the Sixers, they were leading for a lot of this game outside of the fourth quarter, but in that fourth quarter, their offense just fell apart. Embiid couldn't score. He really struggled, especially being guarded by OG Anunoby, who was incredible on him despite Isaiah Hartenstein having foul trouble. The Sixers as a whole didn't hit a field goal for like the last 5 minutes and 30 seconds or something like that in this game. Not to mention the Knicks were just killing them on the offensive glass, whether it was Josh Hart, who shot 0 of 7 but had 17 boards, 5 dimes, 3 blocks, with quite a number of those being offensive rebounds. OG Anunoby got on there. Precious Achiuwa was really good in those settings. They go ahead and close this one out. The Knicks go up 3-1 in this series against the Sixers. A lot of games where it feels like Philly could have gotten the win if they just held on, but they don't manage to do so. And now it's completely flipped in favor of New York. Going back to Madison Square Garden for Game 5, Knicks fans even took over Wells Fargo Center, the Sixers arena in this one. MVP chants for Jalen Brunson, a lot of cheers whenever the Knicks did something. They were having like this big congregation inside the arena and outside after the game. It was crazy. I really haven't ever seen anything like that with a Philly team. Knicks fans really showed out for them. They love this team, and I understand why. This is a gritty squad that never gives up, being led by a guy in Jalen Brunson who's been doubted by so many people throughout his career and just keeps getting better and better. The best point guard in the Eastern Conference at this point, and one of the best guards in the league, period. He was so special in this one. And yeah, shout out to the Knicks. For the Sixers, it really does feel like if just a couple possessions went their way here and there throughout the series, they could be the ones up 3-1, but the Knicks have just outworked them. That's been their identity all season. And the Sixers have to feel pretty terrible about how this series has gone so far when it really feels like a big lead for them has been in their grasp this entire time. Next, let's do Clippers versus Mavericks. No Kawhi Leonard in this game. He played games 2 and 3, but was very clearly not himself. I think last video I talked about it, I called him a zombie out there. Clearly, there was something bothering him because the knee inflammation is back, and he missed this game. It's unsure when or if he'll return in this series. But for the first half, it didn't matter. The Clippers were dominant. They could not miss from 3, went up by 31 points in the second quarter, and it seemed like they were going to sleepwalk to a win. But then Kyrie started to kind of go crazy in the second quarter, helped cut the lead to 17 by halftime, and the lead kept dropping and dropping to the point where at one point I looked at the scoreboard and I was like, wasn't it just a 30-point lead like 5 minutes ago? Why is it now a 10-point game or an 8-point game? And eventually, despite the Clippers fighting back a little bit, with 2 minutes and 15 seconds to go, the Mavericks went ahead and took a lead. The crowd was going berserk. Shout out to them. They were going crazy when it was still a 20-point game. Like even when it was a 30-point game, the crowd was in a frenzy. They were really hyped. It felt like all the momentum was in the favor of the Mavericks in those final few minutes. It seemed like there was no way the Clippers were going to come out of this with a win, but ultimately, Paul George and James Harden saved the day. In those final couple minutes after the Mavericks took a lead, you got a huge step back 3 from Paul George in the corner, fading away where he was like behind the backboard, unreal shot. And James Harden scored 13 of the Clippers' last 18 points. And a lot of it was just floater after floater after floater, attacking Luka Doncic, who, credit to him, has been pretty good defensively in this series, but in this game was just not nearly as good. And I know he did deal with a knee injury. He was kind of bothered by it throughout the game, so it didn't really seem like himself for a lot of it. But I just don't know why the Mavericks didn't switch something up. I don't know why they didn't put Derek Lively back in this game. He was so good when he was playing, but he didn't play, I don't think, a single minute in the fourth quarter, definitely not down the home stretch. Instead, they were dealing with Maxi Kleber, who wasn't really giving them much rim protection. And again, Harden was kind of just walking down the lane, getting bucket after bucket. Weird moment from Jason Kidd, who I've been pretty critical of as a coach throughout a lot of this channel's existence. I just don't know why he didn't make that adjustment. Like, Kyrie was great. Luke was pretty big in the fourth. They just couldn't really get any defensive stops, and I think Derek Lively would have helped with that. Instead, the Clippers go ahead and, like I said, end up escaping this one, tying it up 2-2 behind specifically the play of Harden and Paul George. Harden goes out there and drops 33, 6, and 7, with PG dropping 33, 6, 8, and 4. The first pair of teammates to ever have 35 and 5 each on 75 true shooting percentage or better in the same playoff game. It was one of the most impressive moments a duo has ever had for me in the playoffs. They just really couldn't miss a lot of the night. PG started off really hot. He was leading the charge early. James Harden took over late, and that's why they traded for him. They brought him in to be this offensive punch, to be somebody they could go to, especially if they have moments like this where Kawhi is hurt or, someone's not really playing their best. Harden stepped up in a huge way. Credit to him, he's been the best Clipper in this entire series. He gets a lot of hate for his playoff failures all throughout his career, which, yeah, there are a number of them, but in this moment, he's been their best player. He's taken over. He stepped up when they didn't have Kawhi Leonard, and all the momentum was on the Mavericks side. It really felt like this was destined to be a Mavs win to go up 3-1, with the Clippers falling apart, no Kawhi Leonard again. Oh, it's another Clippers cursed moment. Instead, they stay alive. They even this thing out. They're going to have at least 2 games left. If they can push it to a Game 7, 2 of those last 3 will be in Los Angeles. This was unbelievably massive to save their season. Hopefully Kawhi can return, but for the moment, huge shout out to James Harden and PG, 2 guys who have been constantly flamed for not doing great in the playoffs. Here, they stepped up in a big way and kept the Clippers season alive, really. And finally, we had Game 4 of Suns versus Timberwolves, which, as I'm sure you already know, the Wolves went ahead and won, completing the sweep. At least the Suns had, I guess, a bit more fight in this game than they did all of the other games. Devin Booker had 49, 5, and 6. Actually, really good game from him in an elimination setting, which has not been where Devin Booker's really shined throughout his early career so far. Kevin Durant had 33, 9, and 5. He was also really good, and they did only lose by 6, which was a big improvement from their multiple double-digit losses. They might have won if literally anybody else showed up in this game. Specifically, just 9 points from Yusuf Nurkic, and Bradley Beal was terrible. 9 points, 6 turnovers, 4 of 13 shooting, had some foul trouble. He was getting into it with Frank Vogel, it felt like. Just baffling decisions down the stretch of this game. Terrible performance for a guy who, before the game, after Game 3, said, I've never been swept. I'll be damned if I start now. He got swept, and it was a lot of his fault, really bringing back a lot of questions about the Bradley Beal trade, because now going into this offseason, they have to pay him $50 million for a few more seasons, and he's got a no-trade clause. I don't know how they upgrade this roster. It's all stuff we talked about in my last video about the Suns, so if you want to hear more of my thoughts, you can go check that one out. But ultimately, the Suns are in a really bad spot. I don't know how they improve with this grouping, not having control of any of their picks until like 2030. They're in a terrible spot. Frank Vogel, it seems like, will get fired, according to Woj. Feels like he's probably going to end up being used as a scapegoat. There was a report that came out from Shams after the game wrapped up that basically said that he had lost the locker room throughout the season, that players were fighting the urge to laugh at him when he was yelling in the locker room. Just not a good year from the Phoenix Suns, who really disappointed and fell apart, especially in the series, where it felt like they had kind of a favorable matchup, at least leading off of what they did against the Timberwolves in the regular season. However, once we got to the playoffs, Anthony Edwards basically refused to lose. He went out there and had another unreal game, 40 points, 9 rebounds, 6 assists, a steal and 2 blocks, 57% shooting, hitting 7 threes, great defense, everything you could ask for from your franchise superstar. 28 and 10 as well from Cat. This was his best game of the playoffs so far, really looking more and more like himself. Great defense too. Gobert was great on defense in his limited minutes. He had some foul trouble, but ultimately didn't really matter because they still got the win. Jay McDaniels had 18 points as well. Great defense. And the Wolves become the first team to advance, sweeping the Phoenix Suns and winning their first playoff series in, I think, right around 20 years or so. Huge accomplishment for them. Love to see it. I think their series against Denver is going to be incredible. I also do want to say, get well soon to head coach Chris Finch. Freak accident late in this game where Mike Conley got fouled and he ran into Chris Finch and their knees kind of bumped. It sounds like he dislocated his patella, which is like a 6-month recovery thing. It requires surgery. It's like a year until you feel right again. Just super freak accident that really is a huge bummer on this overall great night for the Timberwolves. Hopefully he's all good to go. He seemed like he was in good spirits after the game, so fingers crossed that everything's okay there. And yeah, shout out to the Minnesota Timberwolves. I picked the Suns in 7. Clearly that was not the right pick. But yeah, with all that being said, let me know down below in the comments what your takeaways were. What do you think about the Milwaukee Bucks, especially if they end up losing in this series? Where do they go from here? What about like the Phoenix Suns now that they've been swept? What do you think about the other 2 series? Who ends up winning in Mavericks versus Clippers? Can the Sixers continue to keep this series alive, maybe forcing a Game 6 or a Game 7? Would love to know your opinions. Again, I'm just addicted to playoff basketball at this point and talking about it, so you'll continue to see daily videos here on the channel, which if you want to see those, leave a like and subscribe, as well as hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on future uploads. I appreciate y'all watching. I'll see y'all later. Real one, say it back.